So here are the four problems that Rome is facing in his lifetime, in his moment in the 50s and the 40s. Everybody is facing this. Now, here's the growth of the empire, and Italy is, of course, just the first piece. Even that has to be conquered and brought together. And then the green is the additional pieces, particularly Spain from Carthage, and the conquest, the war with the Carthaginians. That's Carthage there. So when they take that piece, they get Spain, Corsica, Sardinia, Sicily, and what is present-day Tunisia. So those pieces are added. And then later, by 100, they add dark green and darkest brown. That's roughly around 100. That's Trajan who does that, the brown stuff, Iraq, Morocco, Hungary, etc. So what are the problems for this expanding state? Well, number one, the Constitution, how to govern, and we've talked about that. The big problem of how you adapt a Senate and an assembly to this huge number of people. The Roman Empire at its peak will be about 100 million people. In other words, the biggest of anybody running an empire in the ancient world ever. And all of it has to be run from Rome. And so basically, in the period of the 100s and the 200s, it descends to a general runs these outer areas. It's the only way you can do it. 2, slavery. 3, agriculture. 4, how to run the army and fill the army and pay people and get people to do it. 5, who's a citizen? Very big deal. You have a city that has all the power, and the Roman citizens in Rome have all the power. Wait a minute, if you live in the rest of Italy, don't you get to be citizens? Because now all the power is in Rome, and if you don't live in Rome, you'd still like to have Roman citizenship, so then that's the next step, expand citizenship to all Italians. Well, if all Italians are citizens, why shouldn't these Romans living out in France and Spain get citizenship? And that's going to come up. So there's the question of citizenship, and finally money and politics. And all of these things are going to explode in this 100 down to 0, 100 years. One thing that explodes, thanks to Kirk Douglas, Spartacus will lead the most frightening, dangerous slave revolt, which is totally successful and will at its peak have tens of thousands of soldiers serving with him in the south in 73 BC. It's the most frightening slave revolt of the many. There are a number of them. But the slave revolt of Spartacus tells us everything we need to know about what was going on in the Roman Empire, because at the peak of the empire and of the city Rome, about 20% were slaves. So that, do the math. If you have 1 million people in Rome, 200,000 are slaves. So every house of any wealth has slave servants. Now, the domestic slave servants lived a perfectly fine life. They had to do everything, of course, on order of their master. But in general, they ate well, they lived well, they were warm, they were comfortable. It was just that they had to serve all day. But the minute you moved out into farms and agricultural work, it was hell. We now have the first ever dormitory of agricultural slaves in Italy. We never had one before, but it was found within the last 5 years. It's all been excavated, and we know all the details. And we have surviving slave cells. So you can see, this was dug up, it was all covered up, but you can see what these slaves lived in when they were brought back from all day in the fields. Because, of course, they're all in chains when they're out, but then when they come home, they're put into a cell. Either they're chained in the cell or there's a bar on it or whatever. But it's like, a big box. You can hardly do anything or hardly move around. It was just horrible. You can imagine it must have been hell to live in. And then, of course, then it was worse if you were sent to the mines. So, for instance, there were gold mines in Spain. Well, the Romans were going to work the slaves to death because they wanted all the gold they could get. So that was the worst, was to work in the mines. And then there were other mines. The mines would collapse. You were in the dark. Think of all the horrors. Slavery and slave revolts become a terrible, destructive factor in Rome. There's a general moral decay, and everybody notices and talks about it, and Cicero writes about it, because, of course, the value of the individual human being was undermined right in front of everybody in the form of slavery. So the very ideas, the Greek ideas of human dignity, they had slaves too, of course, was undermining all the general humanities ideas of Cicero. Number two, slavery was wrecking agriculture in Italy because the independent farm owners, and this is going to sound similar to the United States, the independent farm owners, the small farm owners, were being driven out of business because they couldn't make any profit, because next door down the road was a slave-served plantation where growing grain or whatever it was didn't cost the owners anything except to feed the slaves. So they just were killing the small independent farmers. Same thing going on in the United States of America. Independent farmers can hardly make it anymore. All you have to do is go to YouTube and hear a Wisconsin farmer tell you what's going on. And they'll all tell you the same thing. They can't make it anymore because they're competing against these international combines owned by some mega company based in Frankfurt. Same thing was going on in Rome. So it's undermining agriculture. Slave grain imported from Africa is destroying Italian farms. So the small farmers being put out of business. The big landowners were therefore buying up all those farmers going out of business at bargain basement prices. What do those people do when they've suddenly lost their farms? They go to Rome. Exactly what's going on in Mexico right now. Mexico City is packed, jam-packed with former Mexican small farm owners who can't make it, and so they're in Mexico or Guadalajara. And they don't have a good job, and their kids are starving, and et cetera, et cetera. Same thing was going on in Rome, exactly the same thing. Think about the fact that the Roman Republic had always been, everybody who knew it, everybody who read about it, wrote about it, the playwrights, the different books that were written, it was all a family farm-based Republican state. And then some of the men would go into the Republican army and serve under good terms and get citizenship after they'd served 5 years or whatever the number was. And then they would be citizens, and they would be rewarded with a farm. And they'd go back to their farm. They were now citizens, proud owners of a little farm in Perugia or someplace, and they would now live a happy life with a wife. So the Roman Republic had been, in their imagination, a nation of farmers and hard workers and fishermen and men serving in the army with a good deal at the end, citizenship and a farm. Number three, I don't know which number is which, but it's a lot of stuff under number two there. The terrible destructive quality of slavery was, of course, it undermined whole ideas of human dignity and undermined agriculture, but it also destroyed any kind of drive towards labor-saving innovation. You didn't have to. There was no reason to invent a labor-saving device because you had people to do it for you. So, for example, a windmill or a watermill, which is such a brilliant invention, after the fall of Rome, which is roughly 500 AD, all over France and England, they invent watermills and windmills, and they have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them in just a few hundred years. But just that one thing, absence of slaves, everybody looks around and says, how do we ground the grain? How do we grind the grain? We used to have these slaves doing it. How do we do it? Oh, I know what. Let the water turn the mill. Let the water just, the wheels on the mill. You've seen those mills on the wheel on the floss on the mill, wheels on the mill. Remember those things? They're all over England now. They've all been turned into taverns, and they're the cutest things you ever saw. There you are, number three. No labor-saving innovation of any kind until fall of Rome in 500. And then all of a sudden, it goes crazy. Finally, the whole economy was producing things that the slaves could make. So the entire economy was tipped in certain directions to certain kinds of products that a slave economy worked well. Same thing in the South in the USA. Cotton. You could run a cotton plantation, and so they planted cotton. Slaves were not like in the United States of America where they'd all come from Africa. The slaves in Rome had come from all over the world because the ancient world, and everybody did this, if you had a war and you lost the war, you were open to being turned into a slave. Your army, if you lost the total battle and it was over and you were alive, and let's say there's 100,000 of you, like happened in Gaul, the conquering army just has surrounded you, and they just say to you, come this way, line up here, and they just go through and they get a number and all that. So the slave population in Rome were people from Gaul, people from Spain, people from Britain, people from all over Europe, Germans, North Africans, everywhere. You can't leave behind a whole community of 1 million people and just walk away and say, oh, incidentally, you're under our purview, and this is now a new Roman province called Gaul. All you guys that just fought a war against us, put down your arrows and your bows and everything, put them away in the closet, and don't bring them out again, and promise that you won't. That's one of the issues about these armies and the wars, that it produced this enormous number of stateless people who were then put into slavery. It wasn't a success in a sense because Rome simply was getting too many slaves and having too big of a part of their population, slave population, and it was slowly becoming unmanageable. That's what the slave revolt is about. The Spartacus revolt is, you can't do this. You can't have tens of thousands of healthy men and ask them to behave themselves. So here is the symbol of what we're talking about, the very idea that you would build this spectacular stadium where you could have 100,000 people, and the main use of it was going to be games and shows in which people would die. And by zero, this was happening every day. The use of animals and people in one day is so shocking, I don't want to wreck the rest of your evening. I don't even want to tell you how many, but it's just shocking. Lions, elephants, all kinds of animals, every day would be brought in from Africa on boats and then brought all that way just to go into the arena and end up getting killed. Tigers and lions and antelopes and whatever you have, they bring them all in along with everything else. Trees from all over the world were being cut down and put in ships to go into the furnaces to heat the water for the baths. So whole forests are going to be cut down in order to just take that wood and put it into the fires in the furnaces underneath the baths to heat them up. Here are the gladiators in the arena, and by the year 0, these were going on every single day, unbelievably expensive and unbelievably destructive, and yet here's what the Romans loved. So just think about this. Think about the culture that loved this kind of destruction at the center of its state. Here they are in the arena, the tigers and the lions and the stars, the gladiators who became superstars, huge, huge superstars. The biggest stars of ancient Rome were the winners, the gladiators who could last for a year or so because, they'd get the thumbs up because their fighting was so brilliant, and they would, beat everybody, beat every other man, beat every other animal. And here's one of the great ones. There he is. You know how to do it. If you haven't seen it, treat yourself after tonight. That's a great movie to go watch this weekend, Gladiator. It's so good. It's historically brilliant. It's beautifully done. It's beautifully edited. Every performance is perfect, and it's all true. So we end up with this terrible paradox of the value of human dignity for which Cicero speaks, and at the center of culture, destruction of animals, destruction of human beings, vast amounts of money being wasted, and thousands and thousands of people every single day. For them, it was the greatest show on earth. So there's the paradox of Rome.